Just watching your presentation there, and I'm used to doing this often, I'm used to public speaking, has got me lost for words. And that's because not only do, when I see these images, think about what happened to me, but I think about the people that are still held in Guantanamo, still held in the secret detention sites. There's a saying of Edmund Burke, which was that all that is required for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Most of the people in the situations that you've seen and have heard about, in fact, are not the perpetrators of physical violence. It's simply that they stand by and let it happen. And in an Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that whoever from amongst you sees an evil, مَنْ مَرَأَ مِنْكُمْ مُنْكَرًا فَيَغَيْرُ بِيَدِهِ, that whoever sees an evil should change it with his hand, and if he's unable to do so, then speak out against it. And if he's unable to do even that, then let him detest it in his heart, and that is the weakest of faith. That is the weakest of faith. The actions that have been carried out by the soldiers in Abu Ghraib and in Guantanamo and in Bagram and in the secret detention sites are, as you said quite correctly, just a symptom of a problem that existed right from the top, and when it dropped like a penny, going right down to the bottom. And when a decision is made at the top, nobody wants to respond to that, or nobody wants to go against it. And that is what I witnessed during my time in Guantanamo. Just to briefly describe what happened, I'm a British citizen, born and raised in the UK. As a child, I went to a Jewish school. So when I see the images of what happened to the Jewish people, I don't take what's known as the traditional anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish position. I understood very, very well what happened to those people. I was in Poland just last week in Krakow and Warsaw. But I've also understood that it's very easy to become from one point to the other, from becoming the good guy to the bad guy. Very, very easy. And I'll give you some explanations and descriptions of that. But in 2001, I went with my wife and children to Kabul in Afghanistan to work on a project to build a school for girls, which is something that we had begun supporting from the UK during my time there. What followed, of course, was the September 11th attacks, and as a result of that, Operation Enduring Freedom, in which several people, in fact thousands of people, had to evacuate to Pakistan. And that is where I evacuated to, under the cruise missiles and the vacuum bombs and the carpet bombs and the cluster bombs and smart bombs and the dumb bombs. And on the night of the 31st of January 2002, in my house where I was living at the time in Pakistan, there was a knock on my door. I answered the door, and a gun was put to my head. I was forced onto the ground. My hands were shackled behind my back. My legs were shackled, and a hood was placed over my head to darken out my years for the next 3 years. My wife and children were all in the next room. They were awakened by what took place. The people who took me, as I learned later, were intelligence services, which included the CIA, and I was taken to a secret detention facility in Pakistan. I wasn't brutalized there, which was surprising because you'd expect in a country like Pakistan to be brutalized, but it was only when I was handed over to, quote-unquote, the good guys, the cavalry, that I began to experience my first and only experience of torture in US custody. And from the beginning, and it's really important people understand this, is that what happened in Abu Ghraib came as a result of what happened in Bagram and Kandahar and then Guantanamo, not the other way around. The experimentations that took place, the Guantanamization of Abu Ghraib happened only after the processes that began in Afghanistan were completed. And this included, and this is why it was so difficult to look at these pictures in your presentation in particular, the nudity, the constraints, the restraints placed on people, the humiliation, degradation, and of course what you don't see with the pictures are the sounds that accompany them. The ridiculing of a person's faith, of his ethnicity, of his background, of his origin, his very being, seeing the things that you are most endeared to, like the Quran being ripped up and thrown into the toilet, in addition to what's taking place, was just the beginning of the introduction into the phase of being processed into US military custody. And for me, as a Briton, the most difficult thing was knowing and seeing Americans are doing this. Although I'd never been to America, an American had, in fact, come to me. What it showed me of itself was something I didn't really know existed. I didn't really perceive that people with these voices and these accents and their background would be and could be capable of what was to follow. And what was to follow was a description which said, and I quote verbatim when we were taken into custody, is, "You are now the property of the United States of America, and you have no rights." And that was a very apt description of what we were then facing, because being the property of the United States of America meant that you have no ability to control what happens from this point onwards in your future. Not at all. You are completely restrained and constrained, according to the women, to the desires of the US military. And then the part about you have no rights was actually an extension of the concept of you have no human rights because you are less than human. And something that we all do it as human beings, whichever background or origin we're from, whether we're from the East or the West. When we think of a torturer, we dehumanize them. We call them animals. We call them beasts and monsters. In Arabic, you call them haywan or kalb or khanzir. You'll think of anything that you want to call a person to say that they're not human. But if there's anything that they are, it's human. And we do this to the person, clearly, who's the torturer. We'll say that he is less than human. And vice versa. When the torturer does what he does and is able to do so, he dehumanizes his subject and says that this person is so significantly different from me. How he looks, how he walks, how he talks, how he prays, if he prays, and his language and his culture, so that it is so much more easy once you dehumanize the person to walk on to the next stage. And the next stage is to strip the person naked, to kick him, to punch him, to spit on him, to drag him through the mud, to shave off his hair, to shave off his beard, to laugh while you're doing it, to swear at him, to swear at his family, to stick things up him, to kick him, to make him watch it happen to other people. And the worst part of any torture, in my estimation, and there are many parts of it, is to watch a person physically in front of you, anticipating about what's going to happen next to you because you're seeing it happening to the person in front of you, almost like being on a conveyor belt. It's your turn next, you're on the floor, your head is turned to the side, but you can see, if you lift your eyes up a little, as to what's happening right in front of you. And there are a row of people on the floor behind you, all with soldiers sitting on top of them, with a knee into the small of the back and another knee into the head. And you're watching what's happening to these guys. And you're praying two things. One is that I hope something happens before I'm next. And you're also saying to yourself, I'm glad that's not me right now. Anything to prevent me from being there. But to watch the humiliation of another individual, the torture of another individual, and to be able to do nothing about it and remain completely impotent to do anything about it, is one of the worst parts of the torture. Because that hero, whatever he is, he exists in every single one of us. And that hero is telling you inside, do something to stop his torture when you can't do anything to stop your own. And so for me, I remained in US custody in Bagram and in Kandahar, and then was moved to the Bagram detention facility. And in the Bagram detention facility, I was held for about 11 months. And amongst the things that I witnessed there, and amongst the things that I was subjected to there, was a technique that they call sleep deprivation, which meant that a person has to be kept awake continuously for hours and days on end. My experience wasn't as bad as the experiences of others that I witnessed, but some of the things included us being, for infractions of the rules, having our hands tied above to the top of the door or the cage and being suspended there with a black hood placed over your head. And this could be for something as mundane as reading the Quran aloud because you weren't allowed to talk and your voice was not allowed to carry. Something as mundane as speaking to the person that's next to you something as simple as looking towards the guards when you're not supposed to, would all include being taken into this position and being told that you will be kept like this and you'll be deprived of sleep for hours and sometimes months and weeks on end. And also the reason for the sleep deprivation is to make a person as so disorientated and compliant that they're almost a babbling remains of a human being who's ready to say anything. But if you're still not breaking, if you're still not giving up the goods, then there are plenty of other techniques in the arsenal of the military interrogators. And it's important that people understand that there's a sort of a level system here, and at the right at the bottom, as you will hear from my friend who was a soldier in Guantanamo and a guard, right at the bottom is the ordinary soldier. And yes, clearly the lesson of the Nuremberg trials after Nazi Germany had been defeated is that the ordinary soldier cannot say, I was simply just doing my job and get away with it and just following orders, because there are things that are unconscionable. But what's understood, and what was understood at the Nazi trials, is that there was a system and there was an environment created by somebody. Somebody said that this is okay. And just to explain to you where the background of this is coming from, the most senior legal advisor to President Bush at the time of the height of the torture in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib was Alberto Gonzales. And he suggested that for something to constitute torture that has been outlawed, unequivocally, both physical and psychological, he said that for something to constitute torture, it has to include severe physical impairment, organ failure, or death, otherwise it is not torture. So everything that you saw thus far, just from those images alone, none of it is torture. Therefore, it is legal. And if that's legal, then so is one of the things that prevented President Bush at the moment even being able to come down to Switzerland recently, waterboarding. And waterboarding, it wasn't something that I was subjected to, but it was something that many people were subjected to. And just to slightly digress and explain to you, waterboarding, although the president at the time said that this is not torture, it's robust interrogation techniques, it is in fact something that was used during the Spanish Inquisition. In Spanish it's called tortura del agua, torture of the water. So if you spoke Spanish, you'd have to call it torture. But because Bush just about spoke English, he had to call it what he wanted it to be redefined as. And so when you pour water over a person's face and tie them down with their hands and their legs and their head all tied down, and you induce the feeling of drowning, even though a person is not submerged, you feel like you're going to die. And this technique was carried out on many, many people, and many people were tortured. And as a result of that torture, directly, we have, the United States and others said that we had credible evidence to show that there was a tangible link between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. And they used that as evidence to invade Iraq. So this is the sort of thing that was happening at the time when I was in Bagram. The torture that was taking place was constant. It was regular. But the worst for me, honestly, the worst thing for me, much worse than any of the physical or the humiliation, degradation, torture, was being subjected to the sounds of a woman screaming. And I knew, and they knew that I knew, that I was always constantly worried about what had become of my family the night that I was taken. I didn't know where they were. And I didn't know what had happened to them. And they took me into an interrogation room, in an isolation room, and while I was tied on the floor with my hands behind my back to my legs, they brought in photographs of my children and of my wife and waved them in front of me, that they'd seized from my house. And while the sound of the woman was screaming, they said, "Where do you think your family is? Where do you think your children are? Do you think you're going to see them again? What do you think happened to them?" And leave the questions just open without any answer. And it was at this point that internally that I began to break. Prior to that, I was, you do what you want to do. I haven't done anything to you. But at this point, it was a simultaneous, ambivalent feeling of hatred and complete resignation. Do whatever you want, I'll sign whatever you want. Just stop this. And eventually, I, after several months, got a letter from my family. And my wife and children were fine. They'd gone home to the UK. But the psychological scar of that particular series of interrogations has never left me and will never leave me. It will never, ever leave me. Everything else will leave me. I can forgive and forget the whole lot of it. But that part of it is impossible because it touches on your deepest fears. And any person here who's a father or a mother would know that in relation to your closest relatives, to your children, there's just a line you can't cross. One of the things, and I'm not going to go on too long here, that I've done is that I was after that sent to Guantanamo, and Penny made some mention about we all need to spend time alone. Now, I wouldn't say to anybody that you need to spend time alone in solitary confinement, but it does give you the opportunity to really reflect and think about yourself, some own personal time. And although it was the design of the US military machine to break me and the hundreds of other prisoners there, in fact, it made it stronger. I was never a confident public speaker until after Guantanamo, for example. I was never able to answer any questions without fear before being interrogated over 300 times, sometimes with a gun to my head. So there's no question I think any guy over here can ask me that will faze me or frighten me. But that's all down to the CIA and everybody else that goes with it. There's also a time when a person thinks about themselves and wants to try to be able to better themselves in that situation. So, for example, I can do lots more press-ups now than I could ever before, because the first thing that a person does, as you saw in the film, is that they start doing press-ups when they're in prison. I memorized great chunks of the Quran, which I'd never done before. I wrote lists of things that I wanted to do. I tried to perfect my ability to communicate with myself, sometimes by talking to myself. And so there was a great ability to reflect, do some internal reflection. But there was one thing that was also not expected, and that was on the other side, on both sides of the wire. One person dressed in orange, one person dressed in combat khaki colors. The conversations and the relationships that built up between soldiers and guards, between guards and prisoners. And that's one of the things that I came out with Guantanamo with that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting that despite the experiences that I've had with interrogators and many soldiers, is that there were many others who were some of the most decent individual human beings I've come across. And that relationship continued to develop through something that's been mentioned again today, Facebook. I have over 10 former Guantanamo soldiers who are my friends in Facebook. And these guys, they weren't the bad apples, they were the good apples. And there's one that I finally want to finish with, one interrogator in particular. In 2008, there was a film called Taxi to the Dark Side. It won the Oscar for Best Documentary, and that's because I'm in it. And in it is an interrogator, and he's one of the people who was a bad apple. He was described as the king of torture in Bagram, and later then he was sent to Abu Ghraib, where he was part of the first interrogation units. And he phoned me very recently, and when we were talking on the phone, because I saw him in Bagram and saw some of the things that he was accused of having done, he began to cry on the phone and say that I have completely changed my perspective after what's happened. I was more affected than the people I affected. And now I'm trying to do something about it. I've joined the Veterans Against the War movement, and I'm trying to make what I did wrong right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Dave.
Yeah, I'm going to shoot for the 5, actually, because you went a little long. But it's okay. It was good. Did some endorsement, some product endorsement. You went a little long as well, but you brought most of us to tears, so I suppose that's good as well. I got a joke. Knock, knock. Orange. Aren't you glad I didn't say George Bush? Yeah, where to begin on this one? Especially in 5 minutes. I joined the military in 2002. I had absolutely no motivation in joining the military based upon 9/11. I can remember the day that 9/11 happened. I remember watching the news over and over and over and thinking to myself, where can I go today to not have to watch this crap? Because I'm hearing reports about people saying, this is the end of the end, this is the beginning of Armageddon, this was World War III. I think I even heard a report that UFOs were controlling airplanes and running them into buildings to kill mankind. So I really just didn't want to watch the news. I couldn't avoid 9/11 the whole day. Just heard about it everywhere I went. I went and got my car fixed. I went and had coffee. I went to a pool hall. I even went to my friend John's house from high school and was expecting, if there's anybody who's going to be sitting on the couch getting disgustingly drunk, it's going to be John. Sure enough, there's 5 of my friends from high school along with John, and they're all glued to the television watching 9/11. I've been called a sociopath I don't know how many times because I absolutely have no remorse or care whatsoever that event happened. In any case, I joined the military in 2002, and I made the mistake of asking which job was going to be giving a bonus. That was military police. If I had had a brain on my head, I probably would have done something like human intelligence collector, psyops, linguistics, something with a little bit more interest to it, not military police. Military police is what took me to Guantanamo Bay. And I had no idea what to expect when I went to Guantanamo Bay. Embarrassingly enough, I can say that I actually never once saw, met, or knew anything about Islam prior to Guantanamo Bay, with the exception of Morgan Freeman in Robin Hood. Hopefully you know he wasn't a Muslim. He was portraying a Muslim. Obviously there was a great culture shock that took place. Not to mention the 2 extensive weeks of training that we had to prepare us to work in an environment not like any environment in the rest of the world. 2 weeks is not enough time to prepare for that. 2 weeks isn't enough time to prepare for it when your detainees are your drinking buddies. The same people you go fishing with, the same people that you have over for Christmas. You can't really understand the environment unless you're in the environment. Especially when the environment is made out of PVC piping and plastic wire and you're being taught by people who've never been to Guantanamo before. But you better believe every day I was told these are the worst of the worst. This is Al-Qaeda, this is the Taliban. These people are trained in every martial arts you can imagine. They make bombs and they will kill you. They hate everything that you stand for. Remember, we are at war with Islam. Remember, we are at war with the Arabs. Remember 9/11. These are not people. These are dirt farmers. These are towelheads. These are camel jockeys. And every other offensive term you can probably think of that the Americas have come up with for the Arab people. So expecting this this is kind of the picture that I have in my head, Lawrence of Arabia, individuals with swords on horseback, and the wind is always blowing perfectly into their beards. I remember the very first block that we walk on, and I'm hearing Urdu and Farsi and Pashto, Uyghur, Arabic, French, every other language that's spoken in Guantanamo. But this one that stood out, and I just remember it so very clearly, about 6 cells down on the left, I hear Ruhel Ahmed rapping Eminem. And I'm thinking to myself, man, isn't that awesome? Al-Qaeda likes the worst of the worst. They like Eminem. That's cool. I can get with this. I can drive with this. On a more serious note, it really can open my eyes very quickly. The very first block, the very first experience I have with a detainee is a detainee rapping American music. Not just American music, rapping. The worst form of music I think that there is. So obviously what we were taught and what we were socially encultured to believe and to feel our way down to Guantanamo was certainly not what I ended up feeling while I was in Guantanamo. Obviously, I've had some significant life changes as a result of having been in Guantanamo. Outside of that, I really don't want to take up too much time. I imagine that Dr. Zimbardo is going to have some interesting comments, and I imagine you'll have a plethora of questions as well. So to get us back on schedule, I'm going to shut up.
What's interesting is your description of what is really called cultural sensitivity training was identical at Abu Ghraib as well. Chip Frederick told me the same thing. And so essentially, all the military police go through cultural sensitivity training, which in fact is total training in dehumanization. It's the evil Arab as the other. So before you ever see anybody, you already have this mindset. So that's what I wanted to ask you is, how can we resist the pressure toward dehumanization? Because for me, that's really a key. And it is putting that in, because it's what you carry around in your head. I mean, all the torture techniques are things you do to people, but once, as in our study, once our college student guards said, those are dangerous prisoners, that frame allowed them to dehumanize them, to do all these other things. But the question is, is it possible to educate the military? Is it possible to educate prisoners not to dehumanize the other? And how would you suggest doing that? I asked that for both of you.
No, they're a bunch of dumbasses. You go on. Sorry, just joking. I think education is the answer. It is precisely that answer. And when they do this thing of trying to say that the person is the other, it's making those things familiar to that person. So, for example, one of the things that I would say to a lot of the soldiers is to say that the etymological roots of hundreds of English words actually come from Arabic. So, for example, you take the word admiral, it comes from the Arabic Amir al-Bahr, which means the leader of the sea. Take the word arsenal, which comes from Dar as-Sina, is the place of the manufacturer. That's where weapons used to be kept. And you try to explain to them, in your own history, in your own culture and heritage, we are actually very, very closely linked. You look at Arabic numerals are a part of what we use to change the Roman cumbersome numerals. And that's one thing. The other thing is that it's very easy to hate from a distance. So physically, America is so far from everywhere else in the world. But culturally also, it's really very far from the Islamic world. And the only antidote to that hatred is the removal of ignorance through understanding, through learning. And I know that Terry can back this up, but one of the biggest problems of the soldiers that I came across, and in fact the interrogators, was completely having no clue at all. Remember, they'd come to Afghanistan at the time. So in Afghanistan, there are 6 different, at least, languages alone. And in Afghanistan, they were holding Arabs and Turks and Uyghurs and Pakistanis. So they were on information overload. There is absolutely no way they could have dealt with all the nuances and the differences that make the diversity of this world that isn't America. And there needed to be some training, but what they got on the opposite side, in fact, and one American soldier told me this, she said, it was ingrained into my mind to believe that I would be in a Hannibal Lecter, Agent Starling, Silence of the Lamb type situation, sitting on the opposite side. And that's why I did not speak to you for the first month when we saw one another. So it was only after interaction. And that's why I've got friends who are soldiers now, because they didn't interact, and that broke the hype.
Right.
As commonly takes place when a question or a debate is posed between me and a detainee, I almost always disagree. I don't think there can be a happy ending or a situation like that would work out to be fundamentally effective for the military. And the only basis that I say that behind is the idea that we're taught to dehumanize and to look at detainees as objects, because when we do so, we're more effective at our mission. And the military, I don't think, is going to be open-minded enough or accepting or tolerant of the possibility and chance that would be involved in educating us and making us aware. If more of my unit had went to Guantanamo being aware, how effective and how well we have accomplished our mission that we were supposed to accomplish while we were there. I've already admitted to it many times in many different publications and many different media outlets that I often broke the rules. Many times I'd let detainees leave the cell without being shackled. Many times I'd give detainees extra food. Many times I'd let detainees stay in rec longer or stay in the shower longer or whatever they wanted. It really wasn't much of a concern to me because the place just kind of came to be a joke after the first 2 or 3 months I was there. So for the effective purposes of the military, I don't think there could be a resolve like that. I think the military is going to continue to back its guns that we have to do this because this is a necessary measure. It's an insurance and a liability, and that's how the military looks at it.
But you know what's interesting? I've studied the techniques that American detectives use in interrogation, and it's exactly the opposite. The key is developing rapport. That is, it's essentially, if you're interrogating a young person, you want to make them think of you as their uncle or their brother. And 80% of the time, they are effective in getting information. And so the military thing is exactly opposite. It's really building this wall, treating them as the other, and then it's physically breaking them rather than psychologically. So what detectives do is they really psychologically seduce you to think that they're your friend. Ultimately, they're going to send you to jail or whatever. But it's what's remarkable for me is that the military has learned nothing from the years of American detectives everywhere, whose job it is to get confessions. And so as far as I know, they didn't utilize any of those tactics in Guantanamo, in Albert. It was just sheer brute force. It's almost they got it from the Stalin Gulag Archipelago training.
I think what's really important here is because there's a difference between what's a military mission and a law enforcement mission, and it's got confused all in together. I remember the interrogation that I mentioned in which they were showing me pictures of my children, had me on the floor. They had CIA and FBI physically present, but what I understood afterwards is that they were actually physically at loggerheads about techniques and how they operated. But there's one thing also that's really important, and that is that here in the scenarios here, they almost force you to become pliant with them, in the sense that we will completely cut off any relationship you have with any relatives of yours, so there are no communications, no meaningful communications, there are no phone calls, there are no visits. Those basic human rights that you would offer to the worst of convicted prisoners, the people in Guantanamo and elsewhere who haven't even been charged with a crime, don't get those rights. And there's a method to that. And there's a reason for it, so that you don't have interaction with anyone at all. I spent 2 years in solitary confinement, and that meant no communication with any other human being other than soldiers and other than crucially interrogators. And the purpose is that if you want to talk, let alone be friendly with anyone, the only people you can do it with is us. And so you're not even able to unload your woes to anybody who may be potentially sympathetic. And that put them in a position whereby information, which is what they want to gather, can be as good as how weak you feel.
Wow. But clearly, the other American soldiers had to be alienated by you. I mean, the closer you became to the detainees, the more you were seen as a traitor, right?
I like that word. It's the name of my book, if it ever gets published one day, hopefully. Inshallah. Very quickly, I was sort of excommunicated from my unit.
What did that mean?
Obviously, talking with detainees, it's a social taboo in Guantanamo. It's also one of the rules written in the SOP, Standard Operating Procedures. But as I've touched on many times before, we never really had a running copy of the Standard Operating Procedures. Every time you would receive a printed copy of it, it was already outdated.
Right.
So when you have a bunch of people who are running around trying to control an environment in which they don't know the rules, obviously it's not going to be very effective. If I was going to have an intelligent conversation in Guantanamo, if I was going to talk about politics, if I was going to talk about ethics or morals or history, if I was going to have an enlightening conversation, and I had plenty of conversations in Guantanamo that were very enlightening, it wasn't going to be with soldiers. My soldiers were hungover. My soldiers were drunk. They were talking about football or strippers or whatever it is that they wanted to talk about. They really have no interest in me. I'm married. I don't like American football. I've never liked American football. It's not really a sport. And
no wonder they called you a traitor.
and as for drinking, binge drinking really wasn't my thing. I didn't understand the purpose in coming to a place that already sucked to work at, let alone being hungover while you're there. Why make it suck all that much more? So I took it as an opportunity to learn from 45 different cultures, from all these different languages and all these different ways of life, to learn about a faith that I knew nothing about. And my unit did not like that. It started off with giving me little nicknames and calling me sympathizer, calling me Taliban, calling me traitor, whatever. Then it kind of got a little more problematic, like, hey, we brought an extra jumpsuit home. Maybe tomorrow when you show up for work, you can just put on a jumpsuit and we'll put you in a cage for the day, let you hang out with your bros. How ironic, I now call many people brother. And then it just got to the point to where I had my senior leadership threatening me, telling me, we're monitoring your phone calls, we're monitoring your internet usage, we know what you're doing, we have reasons to believe that you're talking with known terrorists over the internet, and if you continue doing this, we're going to arrest you and we're going to put you in a cage. And there's nothing that I can do as your staff sergeant, I can do as your platoon sergeant, etc., to defend you. You're putting yourself up a creek, buddy, and you're about to be screwed real bad.
Wow.
So I think probably about the third or fourth month I was in Guantanamo, it came to the point that I only had 2 friends in my unit. Outside of the individuals who had to deal with me and my leadership, I had my roommate and another individual who I'll talk about some other time. But my roommate, I just had to keep an open relationship with him. There was only a certain number of times he could come in the room and see me prostrating in prayer, and I could just be like, I dropped a pencil. Can you help me find it? Eventually he was going to realize, you're one of them now, aren't you? Yeah, I got my eye on you. I was fortunate that my roommate just simply said, as long as you can do your job effectively and you don't harm any of us, I don't care what you believe.